to talk about the separation of money from state because in the context of it being a civilizational paradigm shift, similar to the paradigm shifts of the separation of church and state, the separation of state-run control of media and information, and human rights movements, right? So I'm seeing what Bitcoin is doing is actually much more than just Bitcoin. It's really that it's initiating a civilization shifting separation of powers for our governments, and can kind of reframe what's going on in the world right now in a way that actually could be much more optimistic than pessimistic, because there's a lot of stuff going on. And so this might actually help make a little bit of sense of it all. So why does this matter today? Okay, so we are really living through this systemic failure of our systems. It's not really a failure of our political system. It's not a failure of Democrats, Republicans, whatever. What we actually have, when you look at the facts, we have rising cost of living. The middle class can't afford housing, can't afford healthcare, they can't afford education, they have student debt, they can't afford to pay back any of their student debt, nor can they even get jobs after accruing all of that student debt. We have a completely fragmented society at this point. It's extremely polarized. We have rising violence. We have a society that's just disconnected from each other, divided, angry, depressed, hopeless, increasingly violent, suicidal. We have our political extremes and polarization, the rise of populism and authoritarianism. We have declining trust in institutions. Statistic yesterday that said 40% of young women are wanting to leave the United States because they have declining trust in our institutions. They can't trust politicians. They can't trust banks. We can't trust our corporations, the big Amazons, Facebooks, Googles, OpenAIs of the world. There's not enough housing. Nobody can afford homes. People are homeless. It sucks. Our government is in extreme debt. We're in a debt spiral. We can't get out of it. Students are in a debt crisis of their own. They have debt they can't get out of. They're just going to die with that debt. We have people in medical debt because they don't have the health insurance to cover life-saving treatments. And we have a rise of lower and middle class delinquencies on various loans, personal loans, car loans. We have people basically borrowing money now to pay for their groceries. Like, there is just so much debt. Basically, people are just living on debt. Nobody actually has any money anymore. This is not the sign of a good society by any means. And we have this K-shaped economy, which is the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And it just keeps getting more and more and more extreme. So you see the stock market doing well, the GDP doing well, but everybody else, their wages just can't keep up with the cost of inflation, blah, blah, blah. All right, so that's kind of summarizing what we've kind of talked about a lot over the past year. Ray Dalio has a great video on his YouTube channel. He also has a book about this, or he has two books about it. But one is the big cycle, the changing world order cycle, which he talks about the powerful world orders changing over time in a very predictable manner. So we see that the United States was not always the dominant power. Before that, we had the British Empire was the dominant power. And before that, we had Denmark as one of the global powers. And so various other nations have risen to be the dominating power, and then they fall off and they're not the dominating power, and now a new power comes in and replaces it. So Ray Dalio discusses in this video here about where the United States is in that, and he marks out 6 stages. So you have stage 1, 2, 3. Stage 1 and 2 are basically like the rising of this new power. It's coming to power. Stage 3 is kind of like the 1950s America. Like everything is super cool. Everybody loves everything. Everything's great. Then there's stage 4 and 5. And we are, he says, the United States is in stage 5 of this cycle right now. Stage 6 is where it falls apart and basically a new world order power comes in. He also talks about the big debt cycle. He just published a new book called How Countries Go Broke, which basically explains exactly how the United States is going broke right now and pretty much exactly what's going to happen. So where are we in that right now? So we are in this stage 5, financial crisis and internal conflict. These are the same indicators that he sees in all world powers that are falling out of power. You see that debt is unsustainable. You see political polarization intensifying. You see internal order breaking down. You see a lot more violence. Trust in the monetary system erodes, and there's complete social fragmentation. There's very often there is this K-shaped economy split, right? So what comes after this? It's very clear that we are in stage 5. Historically, what comes after this is stage 6, which is the revolution or the war and system collapse. So historically, this could be, and this is not predicting that this is the way it will go for us, but historically how these things have gone, you either have a civil war, you have a revolution, or there's some complete system restructuring, which may be sort of the peaceful transition. You often have violent internal conflict or wars, so like World War II, World War I, the Civil War, all of those things. You can often have a debt default and hyperinflation, like we saw in many other countries. You can have complete currency loss, like the currency just kind of goes to zero. The currency just doesn't exist anymore. And currencies that were reserve currencies, like the British pound, lose their reserve status to a new currency, which they lost their reserve status to the US dollar. So you see that an old order dies and a new order emerges from all of this chaos. So it's the resolution through destruction. You cannot have a new thing until you destroy the old thing, right? A couple examples of this, right? So we have the Roman Empire fell because they debased the money, which is exactly what our US government is doing now. That's why they fell. You had the French Revolution because they were in debt way over their head, which led to Napoleon's New Order. You had Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Their currency went into hyperinflation and became worthless. And that's what led to the Nazi rise. And then in the World War I and World War II, the British Empire went bankrupt funding World War I and World War II through debt. And so they lost their reserve status to the US dollar. And that's kind of how that happened. And that was the only one that was really kind of like a very peaceful transition for the most part. The British Empire peacefully sort of transitioned to the US being this world order. Relatively speaking, the US has really only been this world power for, less than 100 years. And we kind of act as though we've always been the shit. And that we always will be. But if you look at history, this is just not the case. So we have options. We can, kind of bury our heads in the sand or, open our eyes a little bit. So Ray Dalio says, okay, what's the timeline for this? He says, typically stage 5, which is what we're in now, lasts 5 to 15 years. At the rate of where we've been going, we've already been in this for 10 to 15 years. So we are definitely nearing the end of this. And I think we can all feel that, how tense it is. So what actually triggers this stage 6? He says, usually it's either a major war, a debt crisis, or a collapse of the currency. So it's most likely going to be one of those. Pick your poison. So the current warning signs with the US, what are we looking at? Well, the US debt is over $37 trillion now. And, even just this October, November, while the government was shut down, it increased by billions of dollars per day. We have the dollar is losing reserve status gradually. This isn't a thing that happens overnight, but BRICS nations have started moving out and de-dollarizing, and China and Russia have also been moving out of the dollar and into other reserve assets. And then we see the political violence rising here, social fragmentation, et cetera, et cetera. So usually this is a pretty violent transition, but we do have the option to choose a peaceful transition if we want, before this chaos ensues. A lot of people probably don't think that the collapse is happening right now, but if you're on my calls, you are aware that it's happening. Because there are a lot of people that do have their eyes open and they see this. Like Ray Dalio, he says, guys, we are in collapse. Nobody sees it. And it's not that they're optimistic, because I think I'm very optimistic, but I still see what's happening. I think it's actually more that people are more just burying their heads in the sand. They just don't want to know. They want to just pretend like it's not happening. But what I'm offering is, let's be aware of what's happening and know that this process is happening and see what's possible on the other side so that we can remain optimistic and not just fall into that doom and gloom and fear and panic. Because I'm not all about that. And this isn't really like a political talk. This is really about our monetary system, but we'll go through that. Okay, so a couple of history lessons here too. So I wanted to understand how church and state actually did separate. The church had control over speech and law and human rights and science, and basically just nobody could say what they wanted. They couldn't have thoughts of their own. They had to follow the church's rules for everything or risk dying, But after this separation, we had modern medicine come out of that. This was the scientific revolution. We started to have democratic governance for the first time. There were human rights movements. People actually were valued. There was freedom of religion. People were widely educated. These are huge, huge, huge societal changes, right? But at the time, if you could live in the time when church and state were one, you really couldn't have seen any other system other than that. You would have been like, yeah, but if the church doesn't rule, then who's gonna rule? Or if the church doesn't set the law, everybody's gonna be immoral and running around the streets and killing people, and we need the church to keep the rule, So you weren't even able to see that there was another possibility. And for church and state to separate, nobody came in and just said, we really think church and state should separate, so we're going to force it to happen. We're going to vote in a law. No, 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 this did not happen. It did not happen at a political level at all. The entire structure had to shift. The entire existing structure collapsed and transitioned into a new structure. At the time, it probably felt very chaotic and very dramatic, and maybe there was violence. But what you saw on the other end of that was something so beautiful. You saw this scientific revolution, you saw human rights movements. I mean, if they could have seen then, oh, if we could just not be scared of this transition, we could see that there's something really great on the other side of this. We don't know how, we don't know, but it's going to happen. And so what actually created those changes? Primarily, it was technology, because the printing press then decentralized the authority of the church. Now, anybody could read the Bible, right? So there was also the structure of literacy. So the printing press created the ability for people to widely read, and now they would learn to read. So now people could have their own opinions and think for themselves. And that created an entirely new economic class, because now you have a much more educated populace, right? So it's actually like nobody came in and like took the church out of the state, right? They actually said, well, we're just going to actually slowly change, and we're going to have the system crumble from within. You know, we're just going to build something else, and that system will just be irrelevant. So they started printing stuff and creating new technologies and reading and teaching people and creating new jobs. And now they're like, we don't need you, church. Sorry. Oof. You know? Also, keep in mind that while change happens really quickly right now, you know, we have AI basically changing our entire, economic system within a year. But they did not have that kind of technology back then. So the printing press took a lot more time. You know, everything took a lot longer. And they didn't have communication like we have now. So, you know, they only really got what was at their local printing press, you know? So everything took longer then, but that doesn't mean that it will take that long this time, because we live in a very different world now. Things happen very quickly now. Okay, another important separation was the separation of information and state. Before we had, the telephone, media, TV, radio, social media, before we had all of that, you basically just had the government publishing the source of truth for everything. So that looked like totalitarian regimes that could control the entire political narrative, right? You had war propaganda. So if the government controlled it and they wanted to go to war, they could literally write whatever they wanted to say, well, this is our reason for going to war. And people just had to believe that that was the one reason, and it must be the truth. They could censor anything that they didn't like. They can silence journalists. They can manipulate the collective beliefs of the whole country, of the masses. So essentially, truth just was whatever they declared was the truth. This has happened over history. Yeah, a lot, for a long, long time. So what really changed this was, again, the technology changed this. Nobody came in and said, hey guys, we really think that the government shouldn't control the media. They just were like, well, I'm going to create a radio, or I'm just going to create social media, and now I can say whatever the heck I want, and it can be shared with like millions of people around the world. So you actually had the printing press also was an early version of this. So You had the printing press, which changed the economics. And then it became very cheap to pass out pamphlets to, for somebody who might maybe had an idea and they wanted to share that idea, they could now print it out really cheaply and spread it around. And so now you have information widely shared that's no longer connected to the government as the one and only true source of truth. So now you have the free press, independent journalism, transparency, much more rapid scientific progress now that science can be, shared. This is how scientists share, their data and findings. And it led to a lot of the civil rights movements, the women's rights movement, disability rights, LGBTQ, all of that. So, I mean, think about this. There are some countries in which this is still the case. Like North Korea is a great example. China is a great example. They can't just write whatever they want. I mean, they will still be silenced or persecuted. And within China, you cannot access the internet. So there are still governments that do control the information. But in the past, the people had no way of even going around that. If you didn't have a printing press and you didn't have a radio, like, how could you communicate? How could you share your ideas? And right now, the government does not control all of the media. We have decentralized media. They just don't like it. And they are attempting to shut it down, but really they can't. Case in point, I'm recording this presentation and telling you, and I can put it on YouTube. Okay. And if I get shut down on YouTube, I can post it to my website and share the link with everybody and tell them to go look at it. The government will try to, but if you have the mass of people that have the technology and the means to create their own information and share it, it will always continue to flourish. Whereas in the past, people just didn't have the means to do that. And so the state always had control, if that makes sense. So anyways, let's move on. This is just one example. And maybe not the best example for what we're talking about as far as money and state. So there's actually better examples. Okay, so right now we have money and state fused. In the same way that there was church and state, information and state, you have money and state right now, which means the government literally controls the money and nobody has the option to create their own money and have it function in the world, right? Until Bitcoin. And this is one of the biggest benefits of Bitcoin, is that just as the printing press and all these other technologies, decentralized information, decentralized education, now all the people have access to it. Basically, you now have a decentralizing of money so that we don't need the state to control the money. Now the people can control the money themselves and make the rules up however they see fit. So what is going on right now as money and state are connected? We have fiat money, which is, as you guys remember, right? It's backed by the faith of the US government, not even air quotes, and that's what it is. So fiat money is backed by the faith of the US government, which basically means it's just a money of the government. The government controls it entirely. It controls the printing of it. It controls the flow of it. It controls the purchasing power of it, all of that. It creates inflation. The way that fiat money system is set up is structurally manufacturing the inequality through inflation. So what do we have right now? It's basically breaking everything that we care about, right? So Because of inflation, we have unaffordable healthcare. We have a housing crisis. We have a student debt crisis. We have people stuck in jobs that are giving them barely minimum wage, and like they can't even afford to put food on the table for their families. We have a US dollar, the dollar, which is backed by the faith of the US government, has lost 85% of its purchasing power since 1971, right? And 99% of its value against gold since 1971. And then we have this AI revolution incoming, which is either going to concentrate more wealth or force us to really rethink money entirely. We also have a food system distortion because government owns the money. Because government owns the money and controls it entirely, they can print more money to provide subsidies to farmers and food manufacturers, which has resulted in this industrial agriculture, which basically creates a high time preference, which basically means short-term thinking. So farmers are really only thinking about like tomorrow and how to make money tomorrow, which has led to soil depletion, factory farming, animal rights problems, pesticides, monocrops, which has all led to obesity and chronic illness. It's shitty. And now if somebody wants quality food that came from soil that has nutrients in it, it's considered luxury food. And now it costs like 10 times as much. But Fiat food, which is backed by the US government, is ultra processed, super unhealthy, and artificially cheap because the government controls it. So when you start thinking about how the control of the money actually affects every part of our lives and our society, then we go to the psychological and the cultural damage. Basically, because the system, the printing of money and the debt-based system has people in this hamster wheel, people are under chronic stress, constant financial anxiety. There's this hustle culture, or you're going to die, which I know some of you have felt. There is incentive to gamble and invest and speculate instead of save. People don't save money because the value of their savings declines. So what do they have to do? They have to gamble. They have to take higher risks. And because the value of that dollar is going to be less tomorrow than today, it's resulted in this culture of consumption. Well, I better spend it now because tomorrow it's going to be worth less. So I'm just going to buy as much as I can now instead of saving money, instead of spending it in like stewardship, right? And it's created a dependency on the government, on advisors, on institutions, on all of these programs. People cannot survive without government programs right now. If you took away one program, people starve, like we saw with the government shutdown. They took SNAP away and people are starving. That's one program, guys. What happens if Medicare runs out of money, or Medicaid? What if Social Security runs out of money? And it is planned to be running out of money within like 10 years. We have all of these programs that are supporting the country, but nobody understands why they even need these programs. They need the programs because their money is worth nothing. So it creates a dependency and people don't feel like they can get ahead, and it's shitty. And workers are not really protected either because now, you know, jobs can just be outsourced to the cheapest labor. And then you have the political and structural damage from the government controlling of the money. It's just resulting in massive inequality, corruption, because when the people in power control the money and there's no transparency, there is nobody saying, oh, wait, hold on, can I see exactly what you did with those tax dollars? They're kind of like, oh, well, we fudged the financing, I don't know. Or like, oh, well, I'm going to bail out the banks because it's for the good of the people. We don't actually know. There's no transparency. There is no money trail, and they can literally do whatever they want. And we would never know. So yeah, the power always corrupts. We have polarization. We have this side saying it's their fault and this side saying it's their fault, just pegging one another when it's not any one side's fault. There's a structural problem. And it's created this authoritarian drift because everybody wants to be like, well, I just need somebody to save me. Somebody save me is what people need. And then as far as wars go, I don't think that people realize that wars are only funded through debt. If you had to fund the war with taxpayer money, they wouldn't be going to war because they wouldn't have the money for it. So for them to go to war, any country, not just ours, they create debt and then they pay for that debt with printed money. So they never actually are spending money that they ever have. And when they go to war, the people pay for it through inflation. And they don't know that. So anytime you go to war, basically the value of your money goes down. Not instantly, right? It takes time for inflation, but this is what's happening. So this is what we have right now. This is what our money controlled by the state has resulted in over the last however many years. And this is why we can't get out of this through politics, because it's really a failure of this monetary system design, right? So now we do have another option. Why can't a political ideology fix this, though? And the root reason why is because both parties, all parties, rely on the ability to print money and take on debt. And without those two components, neither of them can survive. So the economic progressives, they really want to, redistribute wealth. And this is all very well-meaning. They want to do that through taxation, which is great, through spending and deficits and money printing, and let's tax the rich and just basically take on more debt in order to do those things. Well, if you take away the ability to print money, that entire program just doesn't work anymore. The only thing left is taxation. And taxation isn't going to cover a lot of what the progressives want to cover. And then you have socialists who take that to an extreme. But again, they are working against this inflationary system. So even if you give money to the people, but you do that through printing money or borrowing money, you're now giving the people back money that is worth less and less every year. So you're constantly on this hamster wheel. You are literally pouring water into a bucket with a hole in it. So what's the point? Why don't you fix the bucket? And then the conservatives on their side, they're just like, free markets, limited government, let's just let everybody figure it out on their own. We don't need taxes, we're going to deregulate, but we really want a balanced budget, blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, they don't balance the budget. They just keep taking on more debt and printing more money while cutting taxes and deregulating. So again, if they want to continue with the tax cuts and the deregulation and the balanced budget, they would actually have to balance the budget. Without this current monetary system, they could not fund all of the wars that they fund. They could not fund the defense budget, and they would be forced to actually tax the people, because that's the only way that you could collect money. I'm just saying that's what that party wants to spend their money on. They are spending the money on it. But again, if they could not print money, if they could not borrow money, the wars they would be very picky and choosy about what wars they go into and how the war is funded. They would become like real adults having to manage a budget. You know, that's what happened to the British Empire. They ran out of money, so the US took over. And now the cycle just started again. And the US was like, well, cool. I mean, we don't really have enough money either, but we'll just print more money. It's fine. This is a cycle that just keeps happening. And so, you know, it's you know, whatever. I don't know. I don't know what to say. I don't understand why everybody else doesn't understand this, but whatever. So, all right. So, and then libertarians who are just like, want to shrink the government, reduce the bureaucracy. Okay, but they can't do that either with the current monetary system, because the fiat system automatically, continually expands the state power. So every time, as this process just keeps going more and more and more, it gives the state more and more and more power, because the people have less and less and less purchasing power. And without money, you have no power. Everybody can continue to pursue their agendas here, because the Fed will always be like, oh, okay, well, we'll just give you more, you know. And if they stop doing that, all of this would stop. All of it. But all of it would stop. You know, I say the funding of the war would stop, but so would SNAP benefits and Medicare and Social Security. All of it would stop. Okay, so this vicious cycle. I have a couple of analogies just to try to help imagine. Let's say, imagine you're playing Monopoly. We're all playing Monopoly. And I don't know. Mom, you're going around and you're collecting $200 every time. And you're like, yes, I'm collecting 200. I'm collecting 200. Okay, well, I'm over here as like the bank, and I'm just over here cheating. And I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to print myself $1,000 every turn. Yeah, just another 1,000. Just another 1,000. Okay. I'm the rich person in this scenario, right? So what happens if you tax me? Okay, let's tax the rich. Okay, I stole $1,000. Let's tax them 75%. Okay, well, now you've got 75 of that $100. Well, I can just go over here and print another 1,000, and then you tax me, and okay, cool. Well, I'll give you another 75 for every 100. You haven't solved the problem. You're now just taking money from the money printer and taking it from the rich and giving it to the poor. But by the time it gets to them, because of the Cantillon effect, that money is worth way less. So we have to fix the root cause of the problem. So the problem is not that we need more taxation. It's that the people who have the money printer need to stop having access to the money printer. They have to stop printing the money. Okay, let's take another example. Something that's currently happening, right? So Trump just said, we got all this tariff money. We're going to give everybody $2,000 checks. And then we're going to take the surplus and pay off the debt. The math is not mathing. So let's say, this is the vicious cycle. The government notices people are struggling with rising costs. Everybody is aware that people are really struggling with the rising costs right now. Okay, so Trump is like, cool, well, I'm going to give $200 checks. And, and then maybe we're going to subsidize healthcare. I don't know. This is just an example. So where do both of those come from? Now, they say it's coming from tariffs. Okay, well, maybe like $100 of that $2,000 comes from tariffs. Where does the other $1,900 come from? They have no idea. There's no transparency, and it's getting worse. You know that the money for that comes from money printing. So they are going to fund these checks, which is what happened during COVID when they also printed checks for people. And we cannot pick sides. So this is also what happens when you create subsidies for healthcare. It also comes from the money printer. So all of it is funded by creating new debt or printing the money. But usually the creating of the new debt, the Fed just buys that debt, and they buy it by printing the money. So the interest on our debt is like outpacing the pace at which we're growing. Like, our economy is not growing fast enough to pay off the debt. So no, it's not possible now. Maybe it was possible 20 years ago, not now. Not after 2008 when they lowered interest rates to zero, and not after COVID when they just printed money and handed it to people. What that does is it actually puts more money into circulation, and that directly creates inflation. About a year, 2 years later, this is what happened. In COVID, they printed checks in 2020 and 2021. By 2022, inflation was so high, they had to raise interest rates, and it crashed the stock market. Okay, those are a direct correlation. So that's what happens. So now that $2,000 check that you gave the person actually buys much less than it did when they started that whole thing. So now people are still struggling because it's like, oh, you gave me that money, but now it's really not worth much, so I'm still fucked. And now they're like, so now I need more money and more assistance. And so that cycle just continues. Oh, I had another great historical parallel that I forgot to share here too. Yes, this is not right. Okay, yes, this is not bad news. It can be liberating, because now we can see that we do have some power, and that we can take back our power and not be reliant on any one particular party or politician to fix this for us, when we see quite clearly here that they aren't able to, and no matter what promises they make, they are empty promises unless they say that we are changing the economic monetary system. Okay? So I kind of want to relay this back to what happened in slavery. During slavery, we know now that slavery was bad. Okay? Back then, some people, we had two different parties. Some people thought it was the only way to have economic growth, and other people thought it was a human rights violation. And so they were clashing, politically speaking, right? Like, well, we don't think you should do that. Well, we think that you should get off our back, blah, 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 blah. So they tried to fix this with politics. And with politics, they softened slavery. They're like, well, okay, we'll pass legislation where the children are free at age 25. Or we will allow them to, if they save up enough money, then they can buy their freedom. Or let's pass some laws that enforces better treatment of slaves. This is like the equivalent of what our politics is doing right now. Like, you're well-meaning, you are trying to help in a system that sucks, but you're not actually making it better. Like, you're not solving the root cause of the problem by making the slaves be treated better. No, they should have their own rights as people. Like, you have to break the entire system. And to break that system, you had to completely collapse their entire economic structure, because the economic structure relied on slaves for labor to create services and wealth. So the people within it were like, yeah, but like, if you end slavery, then our whole country's going to collapse, obviously. Okay, well, that didn't happen. I mean, there was a war for sure. But again, what happened? How did we get out of that? It was not done by politics, because the politics was, here's some legislation. Okay, I'm going to push back. Oh, here's some other legislation. I'm going to push back, blah, blah, blah. You're just fighting about minutia, and no one's ever going to give, because they were not going to give up their slaves. So before that, We had the Industrial Revolution. And this is technology. So a technology is what dismantled the economic structure of slavery. It now became economically more viable to have the machine do it over the person. So they're like, oh, well, it's cheaper if the machine does it. So I guess we'll do that. And so now, because they didn't need the slaves, now, blah, 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 blah. So you had the north of the US completely embraced industrial revolution, and they didn't have slaves anymore because they had machines doing, this kind of work, right? And they paid people to run the machines. But the South was like, nope, no industrial revolution for us. We're going to stick with our slaves. Thank you very much. And that's when the Civil War then happened. But they were able to survive, and the North was able to do that because they had a technology. So the first industrial revolution was about 1760 to 1840. This is textiles, steam power, and mechanized factories. That was the first one. That revolution started like 100 years before the Civil War. The second industrial revolution started, after the Civil War, 1870 to 1914, which was like the steel, the mass production. We had electricity then, et cetera, et cetera. So there were two, but like the first one that made it economically viable to not have slaves was way before the Civil War, 100 years before the Civil War. Okay, so you're probably wondering, what might it actually look like to have a separation of money and state as this new foundation? Because even I'm not really sure how this is all going to work, but I kind of have that feeling the same way that probably they thought, I don't know how this is going to work without slaves, or I don't know how the country is going to run with, everybody can just say whatever they want on the radio now. Like it feels like chaos. So I'm not really sure, but what we see is that Bitcoin definitely is an option, and it's really not about Bitcoin. It's really about this bigger idea of decentralizing money entirely for everyone, so that we are rebuilding our entire society on this base layer of money, which is transparent. So the government can still raise taxes. They could still tax you and say, you still have to pay 15% of your income, but it might be in Bitcoin. And they're like, great. So you give them a Bitcoin. So they're still collecting money through taxes for the public good. But what they do with that is going to be transparent, because every transaction is visible. They can track it. So there's not going to be any corruption, right? You don't have one person controlling the money who's saying, well, the interest rate is this, or we're going to make more of it, or we think that we need to print more money to make the war, or we're going to the bank ran out of money, so we're just going to give them more. No, you can't do any of that because there's not enough of it, right? You have this finite supply, only 21 million. So none of this happens. It becomes fair because you don't have certain rules that apply to the rich people and certain rules that apply to the poor people. No, you don't have the Cantillon effect of well, the money is worth more to the rich people, and by the time it gets to the poor people, it's worth less. No, because one Bitcoin will always be one Bitcoin, and it is guided by mathematical rules, which makes it equal for everyone. It's also borderless. So we don't have any of this bullshit of US dollar versus yen versus pound and who's going to have more power for their reserve currency. No, you would have one currency for the entire world, and everybody uses the same one, and everybody has access to it. And now everybody is their own bank. They have power over their money. They can save their money. They can invest it in whatever they choose to, but they always know that it will maintain its value and that nobody else can print more of it to devalue it. And so now people have more empowerment, and they have more control over their own livelihood, really. And instead of naturally inflating, we now would live in a world where our money would naturally deflate by like 2% every year. That might be a little mind-boggling to think about. Wouldn't need a central bank, because you would still have a state that has sources of funds from taxation, but you don't have a central bank that's like controlling it anymore. They can't manipulate the supply, and they're not going to be able to print more of it. Nothing like that. Like, I think I just saw a video that was they minted the last penny. Yeah, in the future we won't have a government that's minting pennies, because, you know, like, where did that penny come from? You know, what gave that value? Well, with the Bitcoin, it has value because everybody says it has value. The central bank can make the decision that they are no longer printing physical money. They could because they control the money, they could decide we're no longer printing any paper money, and everybody has to move to digital money. You have to have a phone, and all of it's going to be this like digital currency on your phone, which is kind of the way they're moving. Still going to be the US dollar value, but now in a digital form that they can track. And I say that because it's become pretty clear that almost all of the people of power and institutions are big fans of Bitcoin. And my gut feeling is that they understand what's going on very clearly, and they know that the dollar is being devalued, and that's why they're so heavily in Bitcoin now, because they see what's coming. I mean, I don't know that they know like how that's all going to play out. Also, there are actually like Bitcoin lobbyists in DC, where their job is to go educate members of Congress and House who are in charge of, you know, making rules. And so they are having, you know, conferences on the topic there. And we do have like Senator Lummis. She talks a lot about Bitcoin and pushing Bitcoin strategic reserve, et cetera, et cetera. I've heard her speak, and she definitely knows what's up. I think that she's certainly trying to do the best she can within a system that really doesn't want to give up its control. This is my personal opinion, right? These are not necessarily facts, but it seems pretty clear to me that from history, maybe a bit more relatable would be like the church and state, right? Because when the church controlled everything, they very much resisted losing that power. I mean, they would make up all sorts of narratives just to be like, well, yeah, but if we don't do this, then everything's going to go to shit. You know, they held on for a long time trying to maintain their control. And in some countries, they still have that control, you know, like in Iran. And so, yeah, there's the powers that be. There are definitely people in power who absolutely are not going to want this system to change because they benefit from it, for sure, you know. But I see them all like hedging their bets because I think that they see that it's inevitable. It's kind of like, if you see the sinking ship, Michael Saylor actually posted this image of himself in a life raft with the Titanic sinking behind him, right? And he is just like, hold on. But yeah, I mean, if you know that the Titanic is sinking, like, as what they all did, all the rich people got on the life rafts, you know, but even though they didn't want to lose, you know, but even in that movie, right, some of the rich people were just like, nope, just gonna like bury my head in the sand, and like, I'm just gonna stay here and eat my steak, and like, I don't want to lose my riches and my comfort, and you know, so they just didn't want to get out onto that life raft. But some of them, as soon as they were like, wait, shit's really going down, that's when they were like, okay, let's get on these icy cold life rafts. And it's all the rich people got there first. And that's what I see happening. And that's like the kind of the same with Bitcoin. There's not enough Bitcoin. Like there is not enough Bitcoin for everybody in the world to have one Bitcoin. So everybody will eventually be on Bitcoin and everybody will have some eventually. But right now it's like the rich people are getting on the life rafts first. And that means like they're getting on the like the big Bitcoin life rafts. And like soon there's only going to be like a little like floaty for everybody else, you know? It's inevitable that there is going to be chaos in this transition. And I am not going to tell you that there's not going to be more pain before the gain. Like when slavery ended, a lot of people died so that people could be free. When people were fighting against the church, I'm sure people also died. But for a better future for everybody, you know? So I'm not saying that there aren't going to be some people who don't make it through this. Like it's going to be a tough transition. I mean, we're all doing our best to help as many people as we can, as quickly as possible. But I don't want to be naive to think that there won't be some pain before things level out, you know? And another thing about the inequality, right? There still will be inequality. There's always been inequality. Bitcoin doesn't fix everything. There will be inequality, but it will be fair inequality. It will not be systemic inequality that's created from our monetary system. It'll be inequality like, well, you got a better education, or, you know, you have more skills than this other person. And so it goes back to those things rather than just like you're literally being stolen from and the entire system is against you, where like even people with like amazing skills and amazing education are still like living paycheck to paycheck. Like these things are not right. So eventually it will level out this systemic inequality that results directly from our debt-based, inflationary-based monetary system. Okay, so what does the world look like after the separation? I mean, this is, you know, we're not exactly sure. We can see after that system dissolves and we have this new system, some of the problems that we start to see dissolving is with this fixed money supply, you don't really see these left and right debates about economic issues at all because it's not in their control to do anything about it. You don't have money printing, you don't have wars. You don't have the Cantillon effect, you have fair wealth distribution. You don't have debt spirals, then you're going to have lower housing prices because housing prices is from asset inflation. When you can't get cheap leverage, cheap like 0% interest debt to like buy more stocks, right? Corporations will naturally shrink in size. They can't borrow a bunch of cheap debt to like build up their whatever. When you don't have subsidies for farmers and things like that, now you have more organic regenerative food because the food playing field is leveled out. When you have hard money that can't be printed, there is a hard cap, it's never going to be more of it. That actually results in a savings culture over this consumption culture. So consumers today turn more into builders of the future, and they're going to save and build instead of just buying stuff. When you have transparent accounting, as is required with Bitcoin, you have more political honesty. When you have local communities, because Bitcoin is decentralized, right? Now you have greater self-reliance. If you don't have debasement, workers can get ahead. And when the government doesn't control the money anymore, the government's role in society shifts from a purely, nearly economic role. I mean, if you look in the news right now, it's mostly just all like money, interest rates, this, that, like it's all about money. Or we're going to give checks. Oh, we're going to go to war. We need as much money. We have the debt, da, 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 da. It shifts from like talking about the economics of the country to more about the values and the culture. And we as a society decide what's legal, what's illegal, what do we value. That's maybe a better place than just controlling all the money. Somebody asked, like, well, what can we do about this? Well, so you do have control because you have control over where you currently store your wealth. You have control in, do you participate in the system or not? Because the system will continue to operate such that you give it the power to do so. The more money you give the system in US dollar terms, the more power it has. So theoretically, if you moved all of your money out of that and you went into this Bitcoin system, you're now living in like a parallel economic reality. So you've got the state and money economic system over here, and then you've got this Bitcoin economy over here, which is kind of like a closed loop system. It maintains itself. You can have, if you had your local grocer accept Bitcoin and your employer pays you in Bitcoin, you literally, you could get paid in Bitcoin, pay for things in Bitcoin, and you would never touch the dirty, the dirty, evil monetary system that is existing today. So just like in the slavery transition or the printing press transition, if you continued to own slaves during that time and waited until the Civil War forced you to not own slaves, like you basically were continuing to participate in that system until the very last minute. So all of the people collectively who decided before all of that, you know what, I'm not going to own slaves, that actually took more power away from that entire system. If you didn't have half the United States, moving over to industrial revolution, maybe it wouldn't have happened that way, And then when it comes to information, I mean, if everybody had the option to print things, but then they just never chose to do so, and they're like, yeah, but I'm just going to let the government keep printing stuff, and I'll just read what they send me instead. Well, then that system never really becomes a system. Like you never actually take the power away from the system until you are actively participating in the new system. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about the Bitcoin system. And that's one of the reasons that I feel really passionate about really trying to participate more in this system, because every person who participates makes it stronger. It's kind of like how we try not to use Amazon, because every time you do, you're giving them money and power, It's like it's convenient, but what can we do to try to take power away from the systems that are not helping society? So interesting AI image there. But all right, so a little timeline, right? So 1500s, we separated church and state. 1800s was the separation of slavery. 1900s, we really were freed with information. And I'm saying that now, from 2009 on, because 2009 is when Bitcoin was birthed, we are moving into another phase of separating money from state. And it might, again, take some time, like some of these other systems took time to dismantle as well. But I really believe that we are now living in this sort of fourth transition to advance human freedom for many centuries or thousands of years to come. And we should be really lucky to be living through that and to be making decisions and choosing what kind of world we want to live in the future, what the world we want our children and grandchildren and cousins and nieces and nephews and all of them to live through. Do we want them to continue to live in this world that the government controls all of the money and makes it worth less and less so that our kids can never get ahead? Or do we want them to have more empowerment over their own lives in this new system? So I tried to come up with some, how do we actually get there? Like, what does the bridge look like? Because right now it kind of, if you look at it one way, you could really see that society is just breaking down. But really, it's this outdated system that's breaking down. I still have faith in humanity as a whole, but I really think that this system is breaking down because it's no longer serving society the way that it intended to. And I think that a lot of society's problems right now are very much tied to this system just not working for anybody involved, and everybody's trying to find somebody to blame. And they're all pointing their fingers in the wrong way and missing like the big giant elephant in the room, right? So humanity is not dying, right? But this system is. We are having the birth of a new world. So how do we get there? First, people have to adopt this new money. If people don't adopt this money, this system doesn't work, like hands down. If people never freed their slaves, slavery would still be here today. Like, it takes an individual decision to adopt it. And so the more and more people that adopt it, that's going to be the first step. Then we start seeing this neutral money is reducing corruption. And then we see through that corruption being lost, we start to see the ability to actually make reform to our systems. Through that process, we're able to stabilize society, rebuild the trust with each other, lose the polarization, stop feeling violent towards each other. Then we can really solve some of these problems like housing for everybody, healthcare for everybody, education for everybody. Finally, being able to give a shit about the environment, because honestly, the environment is the last of any politician's concerns when they have no money in the budget. That's the longest term thinking thing. And when they're only thinking about tomorrow, they're going to spend the money on things for tomorrow and be like, well, the environment, that's for the next administration to tackle, So we can finally really start to like address some of these real societal problems that have just been ignored. All right, so back to Ray Dalio here, because he has some interesting takes here. He says that empires rise and fall every 80 to 110 years. In addition to Ray Dalio, I've done a lot of research in other sources about some of these like macro shifts and changes. And what they all converge on is a systemic breakdown within this decade. Like, it's very clear that it will be within this decade. The next 5 to 10 years is when a lot of the chaotic part is going to happen. And it also feels as though it's pretty inevitable and imminent. So part of this definitely is going to happen in your lifetime. Hopefully, right? Sooner than later. I mean, I'm kind of the camp now of like, can we just tear this Band-Aid off and like get on with it? Because you guys are like, I know it's hard to do. It's hard to do that because nobody wants that pain, but this is just not working. And yeah, and politicians don't want to do that either because then they won't get reelected. But anyways, so change is coming. Change is coming soon. That is the cause for hope. But yeah, the next 5 to 10 years gonna be a bit tricky. I am not a fortune teller. I just have a lot of confidence that this transition that I speak of will have some significant traction coming in the coming years very soon. We didn't even talk about the effects of AI, but let's not forget that we also have AI. All major transitions like this, of society's transitions, they all had some element of technology forcing this change very rapidly. If you did not have the Industrial Revolution or the printing press, these changes would have taken forever or maybe never. And with the internet, we started to have a rapid firing of change happen very quickly. And now with AI, it's happening even faster. So what we do know with AI is that it's replacing human labor quite quickly, perhaps more quickly than people expected. And there's a lot of discussion that people won't even have jobs in the same way that they did in the past in a very near future, like within 3 years. So if we consider the fact that we may have a lot of people unemployed, not working, and these robots have taken over the entire economy within 3 years, you can't really begin to imagine what the economic machine looks like in that scenario. It's kind of a wait and see kind of thing, but it's fairly inevitable that it's going to happen, and it's going to shake things up pretty quickly. And, yeah. So Ray Dalio, going back to his big cycles, he has his 6 big cycles, right? So after the 6th cycle, which is the collapsing, which I would say the U.S. is definitely going to be in the stage 6, like within a couple of years at the latest. That's my prediction, my personal prediction. I think Ray Dalio would probably agree, but he'll never say that publicly because he can't say that. But after stage 6, this is when we start to be like, okay, the rainbow, what's on the horizon? Then we move into stage 1. So what is stage 1? This is the new order. So with stage 1, what we have to look forward to is new leadership emerging, new monetary systems established. And that's not just for now, like every other major world power also had some sort of monetary collapse or change, right? Very often it was their currency collapsed. So that's very likely. That kind of seems like that's the most likely thing to happen sooner here. Doesn't really look like we're having any new leadership emerging anytime soon, but for very much so, a new monetary system is evolving very, very quickly. The new order also is a more cooperative period where people are really working together to build. There's low debt because pretty much the debt's just going to be wiped out one way or another. With the collapse of the dollar would pretty much wipe the slate clean, for better or worse. So we start with low debt, strong fundamentals, a balanced budget, a new sense of purpose and possibility, because now we're like, great, well, that's all gone. So like now we have a blank canvas. What do we do? And people tend to be more cooperative and much more optimistic and hopeful. So people are working together. So there are like 2 paths, and one is a violent path and one is a peaceful path. The traditional path was, stage 6 bringing violence and war and really like some pretty massive suffering before the renewal. We did talk about those examples, but the currency hyperinflation, that's definitely a possibility. Civil conflict, societal breakdown, very, very much a possibility as well. The Bitcoin path, however, is the path that allows this natural money to peacefully transition. If everybody, in an ideal world, if everybody were able to move over to Bitcoin into a currency that doesn't collapse, then we wouldn't have people who are left with empty bags of dollars worth nothing. Everybody would have something, right? That's kind of the ideal. Just saying this is an option. I don't know how that's going to work, but it's an option. So we can rebuild this foundation without tearing down the old system. If everybody today adopted Bitcoin, the old system would just and we would figure new things out without any like fighting or violence or whatever. If everybody is using Bitcoin, no country can print money to fund their war. So eventually, no countries have the money for wars. So do they still fight? I suspect that there would still be some wars, but it would be over some. You're going to pick your battles. You're going to have to actually spend money that you can't replace. Like, you're going to have to say, well, I really want to fund this war, so I'm going to take it from our energy infrastructure budget. Like you have to make those hard decisions. And sometimes there have been wars that were important enough for countries to make those decisions. Like, I guess the British Empire decided it was important enough to fight that war. So they did go into debt and ended up, collapsing. But, would they have gone into that war if they didn't have the money to do it? No. But that also means, like, then the other party also didn't have the money to go into the war. So it kind of ends wars. I don't think in the short term, but I think in the long term, it definitely has the very possibility to do that. I think that we think of war today as like, oh, it's just inevitable, it's always going to happen. But there's plenty of things that happened 2,000, 3,000 years ago that we thought were like barbaric and like, oh my God, I can't believe they did that. They're so evil to each other. Like, slavery is one of them. Like, and you probably never thought that slavery would go away. And like, here we are. And we're like, oh my God, why did we do that? That was so barbaric. So it is possible to end some of these systems, but it's not overnight. I think it will still take time. So now we can imagine being in the future, in this 500 years in the future, when our current monetary system has shifted into one that is a decentralized money with no government control over it. And then we're going to look back and we're going to be like, wow, I was there during the birth of this entire system. How cool. So 2009 marks the beginning, and we don't know how long it'll last. Maybe forever. Who knows?